issues that I discuss are issues of national security and foreign policy. And by definition, national security issues are those that affect us as Americans. Not as Republicans or Democrats, but as Americans. The other day, this congressman from Georgia asked my wife, when she was giving her congressional testimony, he said, this is Lynn Westmoreland, who's perhaps most notable for having introduced a bill to put the Ten Commandments on the grounds of the U.S. Capitol. And then when asked by Stephen Colbert, deadpan, what are those Ten Commandments, he could not cite them. He asked Valerie, he said, is your husband a Democrat? Are you a Democrat? Have you gone to the dark side? And the answer, of course, to that is, however I may exercise my franchise as a citizen of this great democracy of ours, first and foremost, I am an American. And I am proud to be an American. I am proud to have served my country for 25 years. My wife is equally proud to have served our country for 20 years. The years that I was in the State Department, we were actually out promoting those values that we all so often take for granted as citizens of this country. Those values that are enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and the Bill of Rights. Now, the last phrase of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which is the amendment, of course, that talks about freedom of speech and freedom of press, freedom of religion, also says that no law should be passed that abrogates a citizen's right to petition his government for the redress of a grievance. And that, of course, is what my article in the New York Times did. It petitioned my government for the redress of a grievance. The grievance I had with this administration was that the President of the United States, when he was addressing the nation and the world in the most important speech the President gives in any given year, the State of the Union address, but a particularly important speech in a particularly important year because it was the rationale that the President was laying out to the Congress of the United States, the people of the United States, and the people of the world, the rationale for going to war in Iraq. And in that speech, he said, the British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. A couple of months later, it became apparent that the facts that underpinned this assertion of the President's State of the Union were based on an allegation that the West African country of Niger had been engaged in a memorandum and had really signed a memorandum agreement to sell 500 tons of uranium yellowcake to Iraq. This is a mining state, I believe, so most of you will know that yellowcake is not, in fact, weapons of mass destruction, despite the fact that Bob Novak asserts that it is. Bob Novak has often written, or often said that the reason he wrote his article, he couldn't understand why they would send me out to Niger. After all, I had no apparent weapons of mass destruction experience, even though, of course, I had been charged by our embassy in Baghdad during the First Gulf War. Anybody who knows anything about Iraq knows that the last time the weapons of mass destruction were used, chemical weapons, was in the Iran-Iraq War and subsequently in the gassing that occurs. Uranium yellowcake, however, is the ore that is extracted from the rock. It is not weapons of mass destruction until it is put through a centrifuge. This was a mining question and not a weapons of mass destruction question. But in March it became apparent because of the testimony of the International Atomic Energy Agency Director General, Dr. Mohammed Boulder, that the facts underpinning, or the documentation underpinning the assertion in the President's State of the Union address were bogus. The documents that the State Department gave over to the International Atomic Energy Agency were determined after a 2-hour Google search to be forgeries, to be not authentic, was the term that Boulder used. The State Department spokesman, in response to this revelation, said, "We fell for it," leaving the world with the impression that somehow we had been duped by these documents. that the world's most expensive intelligence community, $40 billion a year and counting, had somehow been scammed by these documents that were such rank forgeries that the 2-hour Google search made it very clear. And I said on CNN that day in March, I said I thought that if the U.S. government were to look into its files, it would find that in fact it knew more about this matter than the State Department spokesman was letting on. And I said that because I had made a trip out to Niger in February of 2002 to look into this allegation at the request of the CIA in response to a question posed to the CIA by the Office of the Vice President of the United States. I went because I was asked to go. And I was asked to go because a senior official and a senior member of the National Security Council of the country had raised a question, a legitimate question. Because after all, if Saddam Hussein was truly attempting to purchase 500 tons of uranium yellow cake, there could only be one reason for that. And that would be to resuscitate his nuclear weapons program. It was a serious question raised by a senior official. It deserved a serious answer. And if you're prepared to raise the question, you ought to be prepared to listen and take on board the answer. So at the time that the State Department spokesman said we fell for it, there were at least 3 documents in the files of the U.S. government saying there's nothing to, there's no substance to this allegation that I knew of when I wrote my article in July of 2003. Now, I wrote my article after 3 months of petitioning my government to correct the record. I didn't write the article to generate a lot of publicity or attention to myself. Regime change for the sake of regime change doesn't answer the question, what is a national security threat to us that requires the use of the U.S. military in order to deal with it? And the argument I made was weapons of mass destruction. There were a dozen UN resolutions, many of which dealt with weapons of mass destruction in the hands of Saddam Hussein. And if we were going to resuscitate international political will, it ought to be around weapons of mass destruction. I thought, like most of everybody else in Saddam, probably continued to have stockpiles of chemical weapons. I, of course, had been in Baghdad when he used them against his population. I thought it was entirely possible that he continued to have biological precursors, because I had been there when we had transferred some to the Iraqi Department of Agriculture, which could have easily been diverted for weapons programs. And I thought he probably still had an interest in nuclear weapons, and I knew him to be fundamentally bad. I knew the Iraqi government, I knew Saddam, I knew what our national security interests were there because I had been President Bush's point man there in the first Gulf War. And I thought, naively as it turns out, that perhaps that dose of realism might help America's understanding of what we face in the region. And I thought it was useful to bring to the table because it seemed to me then, and it seems to me even more now, that the most important, most solemn decision a government ever makes on behalf of its citizens is that decision to send our fellow citizens off to kill and to die in our name. And we deserve, as a society, to ensure that all the facts are on the table, that we understand what it is we're asking them to do, why it is we're asking them to do it, and what the possible consequences might be to them and to us as a nation of what it is we're asking them to do. That was the